Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Serena Longo, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore and our host this evening at the beautiful WBUR City Space, WBUR, I'm so pleased to welcome you to this evening's event with Jill Lepore, celebrating the paperback release of her acclaimed book, These Truths, in conversation with Robin Young. Harvard Bookstore's bustling fall season is in full swing. Our complete calendar, featuring events with Ronan Farrow, Susan Rice, Martha Minow, John Grisham with Doris Kearns Goodwin, and so many others, can be viewed online at harvard.com/events, where you can also sign up for our weekly email newsletter to learn more about our programming. I'll also mention quickly that WBUR, of course, also has a huge range of wonderful events, so you should check out their programming as well. At the end of the talk, we'll have some time for your questions. If you'd like to ask a question, please come forward and line up at this microphone directly in front of me. We'll get to as many questions as time allows this evening. When Q&A concludes, the book signing will take place outside of the theater. If you haven't already done so, copies of tonight's featured title are available for purchase at the book table in the lobby. And as always, I just want to take a quick moment to say thanks for buying books from Harvard Bookstore. Your purchases support this author series and truly ensure the future of an independent bookstore. So as always, thank you. And thanks, folks. I always appreciate it when people clap for that. And finally, a quick reminder to silence your cell phones for the talk. Not quite yet, but... And so now, I'm delighted to introduce tonight's speakers. Jill Lepore is the David Woods Kemper Professor of American History at Harvard University, the staff writer at The New Yorker. She's the author of many award-winning previous titles, including The Secret History of Wonder Woman, a national bestseller, and Book of Ages, a finalist for the National Book Award. Tonight, she's joined in conversation by Robin Young, Peabody Award winner and host of NPR and WBUR's Here and Now. They're here this evening to celebrate the paperback release of Professor Lepore's acclaimed New York Times best-selling book, These Truths, A History of the United States. It's a volume that has garnered praise left and right since its publication last year. Boston Globe calls it gripping, moving, and beautifully written, and Andrew Sullivan writes for the New York Times, "It isn't until you start reading it that you realize how much we need a book like this one at this particular moment. It's a big, sweeping book, a way for us to take stock at this point in the journey, to look back, to remind us who we are, and to point to where we're headed. Its reach is long, its narrative fresh, and the arc of its account sobering, to say the least." We're so pleased to host this event here at WBUR City Space tonight. Please join me in welcoming Jill Lepore and Robin Young.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for being here. It is always a delight to talk with Jill. And
we were so eager that we came out early.
And we've already, just, chatting in the back room there, we've already, had a little bit of a cry over Vietnam and Ken Burns' documentary. So we've already plunged in here. But it's also just such a pleasure to speak to you now because there's just nothing going on that will interest historians years from now. So here is the book. How many of you have read it? Oh, wonderful. And those who haven't, you're in for a treat as well, because this one will be lighter than the one everybody else lugged around. This is the paperback. We're going to put it there and hope the table doesn't flip. It's almost 1,000 pages. It's a doorstop of a beautiful book. And you say in it that the founding fathers were like scientists, the founding a form of inquiry, there's that word, Alexander Hamilton asking, are men really capable of establishing good government from choice, not force? And that your book, These Truths, is an attempt to answer that question. Everything from Columbus to Donald Trump in that volume. Before we go into the book, and we're going to have a time for questions from you all at the end, what are you thinking in this moment in history having written that book?
Yeah, thanks for starting with an easy question, Rob. First, I just want to say how lovely it is to be in this beautiful space and just be a part of the WBUR community and the Harvard Bookstore community, two of my very favorite institutions, as a longtime resident of Cambridge and Boston. So it's just a huge, and to have the chance to be on a stage with Robin Young is just incredible. So a hand there.
There will be a moment when we were all going. Jill and I will let you know when the T is parked there, and then we're all going to turn around and wave to people through the window.
Do we have to quack? Okay, different thing. Okay. How am I feeling at this moment in history? These are interesting historical times. I guess. One of the reasons I became a historian is because I get my head turned around so easily by what's going on day to day, and I find that my head's spinning at a much faster rate, with the acceleration of our news, and history slows me down, and I sort of force myself to pause and take stock and sort of. Where are we on a timeline? If we were plotting something across a timeline, we are like our x-axis, and maybe it's polarization, or it's income inequality, or it's viciousness in political rhetoric, or it's the number of articles of impeachment that are introduced into Congress. I always have some interest in pulling that timeline along and sort of seeing where we are along there, as opposed to how does this feel compared to yesterday or this morning or last week? Because everything just vanishes so fast right now. I mean, that has always been the case for me. I have like a really good long-term memory, but a very bad short-term memory. So at the moment, I learned today that resolutions for an impeachment had been introduced into the Congress ever since John Tyler's presidency in the 1840s, with great infrequency, like a half a dozen times, until Ronald Reagan's presidency. And since Reagan, resolutions calling for impeachment have been introduced for every single president. And that isn't really an answer to your question, but it is a kind of metric for me where I'm like, well, this does feel a little bit different. It's like something else is going, impeachment is meaning something different. How it's functioning constitutionally and politically is in the midst of a big change. And so that helps me think, well, what did it mean in Tyler's administration? Like, then I want to ask that question, which I'm just going to say, like, of all the people who are asked on CNN or Fox News about impeachment, I don't think anybody's coming up, I want to talk about John Tyler. But like that's where my mind goes, and it's sort of just to slow down, calm down, which isn't always the right thing. Sometimes you shouldn't be slowing down; you should be charging the barricades. But I kind of need the discipline of history to slow me down.
Oh, I think we need that all at this moment too. And I look at the title, "These Truths," and we are living in a time when we don't have agreed upon truths. I mean, we just did a story today with NPR's David Folkenflik about how Fox anchors are fighting with each other. You have this is unheard of. You have MSNBC, and then he told me also CNN cutting away from President Trump's press conference because they didn't feel that they could fully get the truth out soon enough, that they were letting untruths linger too long. And that's unheard of. I mean, there is a sort of a mandate in broadcasting when you're covering a president, you are not allowed to edit them and you're not allowed to cut away from them. So, for instance, if, President Trump or any president before him started speaking, you have to make a decision. Are we going to cover that because we have all these built-in breaks on programming that some stations can't change? They just happen automatically. And you're not allowed to do that. You are not allowed to break away from the President of the United States. And here we have networks deciding to do that. So it seems a particularly interesting time. But I want to go back to the very first page of your book, blank page, except for a line from Lincoln, which I think about a lot now. We must disenthrall ourselves, and then we will save our country. What does that mean to you now, and what did it mean to him?
I wish I fully understood what it meant to him, but it really spoke to me when I came across it. I do really love it. I know for me, that sense of feeling a little too plugged in, that's the being enthralled in the thrall to whatever political messaging that's coming to me, that's being targeted at me. What does it mean to unplug in that way? And disenthrall in the sense of unplug for me. And use the capacity for judgment and discernment and evaluation of the evidence that actually citizenship in a republic requires and demands. That's what the inquiry is, and that's what these truths in my choice of title is all about. But I do actually want to, I don't need to dodge that question, but I want to sort of think about that change in journalistic practice that you referred to with regard to covering the president. Because, of course, that changed with the campaign. Trump was covered really differently, and I think there's a mea culpa that animates a lot of the press today around what were the ways in which Trump was covered during his campaign.
Well,
that
talk
introduced
more about
problems.
that, because, we had battles about sometimes maybe the less seasoned of the reporters or producers feeling, well, there has to be a moral equivalence. If you say one thing about Donald Trump, you have to find an equal thing to say about somebody else. I mean, is that what you're talking about?
Well, let me put it in a slightly different frame, which is to say to think about it as a problem created in the 1950s and not in the 2015 campaign. There's been a lot of really interesting scholarship lately on the history of the adversarial press. And if you think about it, so TV is, some households have TV, say the election of 1948. By the election of 1952, majority of American households have television. It really changes what newspaper reporting does, because if you think about it, newspapers, they often have two editions, or the same company will have a morning, like the Worcester Telegram and the Worcester Evening Gazette or something, but they can't be confident that they're giving you the news before anybody else of what happened that day, because you can get it on the television news. And meanwhile, Joseph McCarthy has risen to power in the United States and Joseph Stalin in the Soviet Union. And news organizations that have newspapers change their practices and decide that in the age of McCarthy, you basically just can't report what McCarthy said, because McCarthy is dangerous and he's lying. And so it was a real dilemma. Like newsrooms, people got together and said, what should we do? Obviously, so does television and radio have that same conversation. But they decided to cover Washington much more aggressively and in a much more adversarial way, and not be stenographers of the messages that are coming out of the State Department or coming out of the White House, but instead to have, the New York Times invents this new subhead called news analysis that they put on the front page to tell readers, this is reporting, but it's actually also analysis, because TV's not that good at doing that. TV worked so fast in the 1950s and 1960s, but there's not necessarily for the nightly news show. There could be the weekly news magazine, like 60 Minutes, can do something really penetrating. And the same, of course, obtains on the radio. But journalism gets much more aggressive and adversarial, and that's really important for breaking the stories involving the lies of the Johnson administration and Watergate and in Vietnam, and for unraveling the story of Watergate. And when Trump declared to run for office in 2015, a somewhat similar conversation was had, I think, in a lot of newsrooms of like, well, this is maybe a game changer because this guy is out here like calling, engaging white nationalists and calling for, violations of basic civil liberties for minorities. And that was, I think, one conversation, like let's be more hard-hitting. But another conversation was, this is really good for our ratings, to spend a lot of time with him, about him, hearing from his sock puppet people and whoever were these various placemen and women. So it ended up, I think, unlike the kind of McCarthyism-driven, fiercer, more forward-facing news reporting, the Trump era, I think, caused a lot of news organizations to wonder whether they were making mistakes, including the false equivalence issue. But that's not actually that's not the problem that I was imagining.
Well, I mean, let's stay with the press for a while, because there's all different threads, and one of them is that post-Watergate, we know it. I mean, it's documented, and you write about it as well, that there was an agreement between many people, Bill Kristol and Roger Ailes. This is never going to happen again. We're going to have our own media. We're going to start television stations and newspapers and radio programs, and we're going to have our own media. And it turned on some of them. I mean, Bill Kristol is one of the biggest voices trying to warn his fears about Donald Trump, but the media that he helped create is what helped put Donald Trump in office.
Yeah, and like all revolutions, it's eating its elders. I mean, that is a sort of that what's come to happen. It's a really complicated story, that long story of the rise of the conservative press, because a lot of it involved a long delayed and continuous struggle, honestly, against FDR's New Deal. I mean, the original conservative critique of the press was an indictment of the Federal Radio Act of 1927, which wasn't even part of the New Deal. It was a Hooverism, but it's rewritten as the Federal Communications Act in 1934 and leads to the establishment of the Fairness Doctrine, equal time, and the role that the federal government plays in radio broadcasting. And conservatives in the 1950s come to believe that that is essentially a Rooseveltian conspiracy to suppress conservatism. And they begin, in the 1950s, conservatives are talking about the liberal media. And their big demon is the FCC. And so on one time horizon, we see that manifest, because of course it's under Reagan that the FCC's Fairness Doctrine is abolished in 1987, after just protracted battle. It is a huge conservative victory, and that's what makes possible MSNBC and Fox News. You couldn't have had those cable stations with their single political positions, without the abolition of the Fairness Doctrine. So finally, like, FDR's grand conspiracy against the conservative press is realized, and that, is defeated. But I think the piece of that, there's a kind of straight line from that to Ailes and our current woe. But what we I don't think, always so clearly see is where that actually paid off. It wasn't in cable news for all of its force and power, or talk radio of the kind of Rush Limbaugh kind of 1980s version, but was in fact in opening up the internet to commercial traffic in 1996 with the Federal Telecommunications Act as a wholly deregulated form of communication. So the internet could have fallen under the regulation of the FCC as like any other kind of transmission, but it becomes this huge libertarian conservative feat on the part of Newt Gingrich to insist that no, the FCC was like this New Deal liberal monster. The internet will be our libertarian free space. And that's heartfelt and genuine. I mean, it's a deep, sincere commitment to libertarianism, but I think in the end has had a much greater after effect even than the abolition of the Fairness Doctrine and the establishment of cable news.
Well, I want to go back to the beginnings of the book, in which, actually it's more like towards the middle, in which the role of newspapers, I just love how you describe how when the Constitution was written, it was on, have I got this right, 4 pieces of parchment paper, and they were put inside newspapers?
Yeah, so it's after they finally deliberate, from May to September, they've come up with their draft, they send it to the Committee of Style that makes it a better read, and then they have this beautiful parchment version that, is signed, but then it goes to the printers, and it's printed as like a little broadsheet, but most people don't go down to the Harvard bookstore and buy the Constitution as a broadsheet. They go down to the bookstore, their printing house or whatever, and pick up their newspaper, and it's an insert. And that's how most, because the whole idea was it wasn't the new frame of government until ratification. And for the ratification process to work, people had to read it. And they had to talk about it, and they had to talk to people who were going to be at the ratifying conventions. And so you'd get your paper, and you'd open it up, and there would be the Constitution.
I love that.
Well, so I tell the story of the New York Packet, which prints the Constitution in October of 1787. So things finished on September 17th. It takes a little while. You got to set the type. I mean, you got to think of all the types. It takes a while to set the type. And then you can go down to the printing shop, and you could buy your almanac for 1788. You know, like you'd need that for the days of the month, and you keep your accounts in it. And you could buy it with the Constitution or without. It's kind of like the same price. But you buy your almanac, because everybody's going to buy an almanac. It's the most commonly owned book. But you go pick up the New York Packet, and the Constitution isn't in it. There's an ad for buying the almanac, which has the Constitution. But I hand out, the newspapers in the 18th century were one big sheet of paper, like a picture like the sheet that is the Boston Herald, but bigger, and it's 4 pages. There's the front, the back, the front, and the back, and it's folded up. And so it's just this one big sheet of paper. It's always 4 pages. And I teach a class where I hand it out. I have these facsimiles made of this New York Packet from 1787. And I hand it out to this room like this, and people are like, what the hell is this? Because my students have never read a newspaper. So they hold it, and they just don't, like, they don't know what to do with it, and they take out their phones and take pictures of it. This is no aspersion on my students. My students are amazing, but they really, they're delighted by it. It's like a lollipop. I mean, it's fascinating. It's like interesting. What is this? And so I give them a few minutes, and they look at it, and then I was like, what is in this issue of the New York Packet? Why what are we finding here? And they call out things. Well, like, you know, it'll be like, well, there's a ship from St. John's coming into the harbor next Tuesday, or, you know, they're reading the shipping news, or you know, John McDonough lost a horse who's 11 hands high and is a rust-colored mare. You're supposed to let them know if you see it wandering around town. Like, they read the classifieds. And then, so we spent a lot of time just, what is a world in which, like, you advertise for your missing horse in the newspaper? And just to get them immersed. But it takes them a little while, but then there are 3 things that they find. One, that we end up talking a lot about. One is the first of the Federalist Papers, which is by Alexander Hamilton, arguing for the ratification of the Constitution. One is a letter to the editor signed "A Lover of Truth," which is objecting to the Constitution. And then one is a classified ad for a young Negro wench and her 6-month-old baby who is still nursing. And this is how it is written, that she is very good at all manner of housework. And you're supposed to go to the printer and inquire, and her owner can be found that way. And Alexander Hamilton's Federalist Number 1 is all about our capacity to govern ourselves, and what a magnificent moment this is in the history of humankind, that the delegates of the Constitutional Convention have framed a form of government that allows us to govern ourselves. And then, like, that's on page 2, and immediately opposite on page 3 is this ad for a young woman and her child who are property of someone, and they are not governing themselves. And it's just your whole kind of stomach drops out when you look at it. And the students, like the kind of reality of the atrocity of slavery and the way in which slavery is the other side of liberty in the early American Republic, just comes shattering down on them. There's no denying. And then we sort of spend a lot of time trying to reckon with it. But it's the inquiry itself that's meant to model for them what it is to be a citizen, right? Like, you have to reckon with that. Like, it's our obligation to look at that issue of the New York Packet at some level, right? In whatever form that takes. Maybe it's, you know, the 1619 Project of the New York Times, or whatever it is where you are reckoning with that, whatever you're reading or thing you're talking about. It is everyone's obligation. That is our common history. I like to do that with, you know, physical things, because it's somehow a little bit of a buffer from the incredible kind of historical agony of a very conflicted past.
I want to read a little bit when you describe these papers, because you're writing your ass off here, but it just drives home what you were saying. So the free people of the U.S., these were the people who were reading the papers and getting this Constitution. The free people of the U.S. were asked to consider this thing they found folded in their newspaper as they went about baling hay, milling corn, tanning leather, singing hymns, letting the seams out of last year's winter coats for parents grown fatter or kids grown taller. It was history preserved like baby teeth in a jar in the 4 parchment shears of that Constitution in hundreds of newspapers where arguments for and against appeared alongside shipping news. I'm just, as you say, it was a common, for free people, it was a common experience. Slavery, because in reading I wanted to say, okay, so how come they did that? Because here they were writing this Constitution demanding freedom. And you write about how fraught that was. And then you've also said that you wanted to write about the people who were the sidebars. And I liked this moment. 1782, James Madison is in Philadelphia. He's been serving in the Continental Congress. He has to go back to Virginia. And he writes to his father and he says, I don't really know what to do because my man Billy, his enslaved man, he's been his property since he was a child, since they were both children. And Billy has been living with him in Philadelphia for the whole of this time that he's serving in the Congress. And Philadelphia has abolished slavery. So Madison can't sell Billy, and he writes to his father, but I don't want to bring him home either, because he now knows what liberty means, and he'll just convince everybody at Montpelier, the Madison plantation, to run away. I kind of respect that. Like, I do respect that he knows what liberty means. I, James Madison, who will go on in just a few years to draft the Constitution, I know what that means. What a conflict. What a strange, bizarre thing.
Yeah, but that is a daily experience. I mean, also Billy, who renames himself William Gardner when he becomes a free man. For Gardner, I mean, that is that there was an opportunity to become a free man was the unusual thing about his experience. It's interesting. When I was in college and in graduate school, the leading luminaries in my field, early American historians, were all these political historians whose names I will not name, who spent a lot of ink defending the position that it was a different time, that this was kind of the era of the founder's chic, when all the doorstop books were about a different founding father and his eminence and greatness and wonderfulness and how well he rode a horse and didn't he look mighty fine in that hat and he said these noble things and he was quite sexy with the women. Like, they're just like, it's just fawning whatever nonsense. And there'd be like a little paragraph like, well, I mean, it's true that he did, I had some slaves. But it was a different time. And nobody thought about that then. And we shouldn't, it's improper to hold people to moral account for. And while it is improper to hold people to moral account for something that they could not conceive, they conceived it every day. Right? Like, that is why they own the horse. That is who made the hat. That is the teeth in their mouth. Like that, it was a crazy, willful dishonesty on the part of the historical profession. So, I mean, this particular niche of the historical profession. And meanwhile, there had been this incredible revolution in American historical writing since the 1960s with the founding of, the first Black Studies departments, later African American Studies Department, Ethnic Studies Department, Native American Studies Departments, Women and Gender Studies Department. People found out about the daily lives and experiences of people like William Gardner or Sally Hemings, or we could think about millions of people, some number of whom have biographies that can be reconstructed. And they're just writing these two completely different scholarships. There's this kind of crazy heroism of the flawless founding father ordained by, kind of the divine anointing of God. And then there's this kind of struggling, messy experience of ordinary people. And what I wanted to do in the book, and the reason I linger over things like that, essentially it's like a biblical parable for me, that story about James Madison and William Gardner, right? Like it's like Joseph and his coat of many colors. I'm not trying to elevate myself to the scribes of the Old Testament, but like I'm trying to use it like a biblical parable. Like at the end of the day, it doesn't tell you very much. Like, well, so Madison wrote some letters to his father when he's trying to leave Philadelphia. It doesn't move my story. It's a parable about the world that we are all descended from, both William Gardner and James Madison, and their stories are all our stories. So that's why they're all kind of on every page. That's one that's actually hard. It's hard to tell that story from the vantage of William Gardner because the archival record doesn't really allow it. But there are other stories. I tell a story of Harry Washington, a Gambian man who was for a time owned by George Washington and took his name, or was assigned his name, whose story you can tell a little bit from the story of Harry Washington because it's been incredibly carefully reconstructed by historians. But I think that work of integrating American history that has been a very segregated past, and the reason, big part of the reason I wrote the book was to attempt to do the work of bringing to bear the incredibly rich scholarship from both, the best scholarship from both of those ways of thinking about the past.
Well, I mean, as always with Jill Lepore, I mean, we could be here all night. A slumber party, that would be so cool. Why not, right? Wouldn't you?
It's like night at the museum, but it's night at VUR.
Oh my!
You gotta wake up with Bob Oakes.
Yeah. And I have, people. That's such a good idea. I'm going to remember that. Sleep over at BUR. But in the meantime, I know we want to make sure that you guys get to ask your questions, both about history and today. So I just want to ask you a little more about you, Jill, because you think, where did this spring from? And wouldn't you love to have her for a professor? But you write about, and it's again when you're talking about this important of this tangible thing that you used to just breathe in. You and your siblings, you paint a picture there. You're sitting on the wood panel tailgate of a 1972 Oldsmobile station wagon, dangled like a broken jaw, that thing that flops down in the way back, a wobbly bench for 4 kids, 8 legs swinging. I've been up since dawn for the fundraiser, so 8 legs swinging. Every Sunday before dawn, yanked out of bed to stuff the car's way back with stacks of twined tied papers, riding around time, delivering the papers with your dad. It was the Worcester Sunday Telegram. I know. Just a little more about where you came from, and how it might have formed you.
Yeah. My dad was a really good guy. His name was Frank. He had a column in the Clinton Daily Item called Frankly Speaking. It was kind of like an Art Bookwald kind of thing. Little Andy Rooney, remember Andy? And another thing. It was a little like that. My parents were both public school teachers. I was the youngest of 4 kids. We all worked a gazillion hours as kids. We all had like 5 or 6 jobs. It was really important that we work all the time. We didn't have any money, but there was more. It was a kind of Depression era parents' story. My parents were born in the 20s, had very tough childhoods, and so I remember getting my first bank account at WCIS, Worcester County Institute for Savings. Yeah. Passbook account. No big WCIS fans. My dad wrote a fake work permit for me when I was like 13, so I could work at, does anyone remember the Fair? Totally skeevy department store. I worked in the shoe department. You never saw me on the floor because I was in the back room reading books. I had 1,000 jobs as a kid, so I do actually have a very highly developed work ethic, but it was because we worked all the time, which was actually okay. It wasn't I don't complain about this. Like, the newspaper was a really important family business. Was how we understood ourselves as people in the town. We were the people that delivered the paper. We knew everybody. We delivered the paper all over town.
I actually think I'm a little bit older than you, but I think we were luckier in that, you could. rake a lawn or babysit or be a mother's helper or deliver a paper or I worked at a really, really dank stationery store that sold, it was right in the middle of town, but you could tell the books that were going to be a little whatever because they had purple binding, purple, the pages were purple on the edge. And that's what I'd be sitting reading.
That's right.
When I
It's
was
like
13.
the knockoff Ballantine, slightly porny
Right.
paperbacks. Yeah.
But it was okay. In other words, you didn't have to land a job as an intern on Wall Street. I wouldn't even have known what that meant.
Right.
It seemed a little okayer. But something else that formed you, and I've asked if we could talk about this, is the most, I'm going to get all teary, this exquisite essay that you recently wrote in the New Yorker about your friend Jane. Yeah. 20 years ago, she passed. In fact, you were giving birth to a baby as she was dying, and your friends raced the picture over to her. And you wrote that you were both historians. She was very different. She seemed to be, everywhere you went, a dry cleaner. She knew everybody in the dry cleaner, and you seemed to have your head more in a book or something. But you say that when people say to you, why so many babies? Because you just wanted to have them one right after the other. And why so many books? Why so fast? That Jane is the how, the why, the rush, the fire. And that she never got to do the things that you both wanted to do, but you did. How was she the rush? Was it because she died young?
Yeah, first of all, I'll say, I don't normally write personal essays for all kinds of reasons, and I was very hesitant to write this essay. I wrote it really for my editor at The New Yorker, who's a person I really admire, and kind of as an explanation. I don't know him at all. Honestly, it barely is like an email address. But I'm a weird writer. I'm always, I will drop everything and write. I write really fast. I write about anything. I have a little nuts. And I think an editor is I'm not going to ask because I don't want to wreck it. That's good for an editor, right? But I had so my friend Jane died while I was just after I gave birth. She was dying of leukemia. I brought her to Beth Israel the first night. I had my baby at Mount Auburn, but she had gone, we were at Yale in graduate school together, and her health insurance wouldn't allow her to stay here. So she went to Yale, New Haven Hospital for her later rounds of treatment and bone marrow transplant, and that's where she died. So I wasn't with her at the end. And she had decided to, when it was clear that she was going to die, she decided she wasn't going to die until my baby was born, which was a gift to me, an incredible gift. And I think the fact that she would even think of that is a testament to her character. The fact that she did it, lived for many months longer than she was supposed to, is a testament to the force of her will. And of our love as friends. And it really shattered me. You have a new baby, your best friend's dead, you can't grieve, you have to take care of the baby. And I just kind of put my grief in a box. And I also kind of became wildly committed to writing about all the things. She left me her computer and all of her books in her will and her unpublished dissertation. And I just felt like I needed to finish the work that she had begun somehow. That she wanted to be a writer, she wanted to have children, she wanted to have this swanny career. And anything that came to me, I would maybe say no to because it was too much. I was too tired. I didn't have the energy, or I didn't have the ambition. Or the courage, or whatever. I would say, well, Jane would be really excited if I would write for The New Yorker. I have to say, yes, the kind of thing that would really tickle her. It would tickle me too, but I would just do way more of it than I would otherwise have done. And at the 10th anniversary of her death, which I didn't really write about in the piece, but I went to the archive where I had left her papers, and I opened up the box because I thought like, oh, I never had opened up the computer. That just scared the hell out of me. But I printed out a bunch of stuff in her dissertation. I put it all in an archive, and I went and opened up the box. And I just sat in the archive and cried because I thought she was going to be in the box. And like I would get to visit with her. I would hear her voice. It would be like being in her company. She wasn't in the box. I was like, okay, historical research sucks. Like all this time I thought I was hearing voices and people are talking to me from the past, but like turns out it's just crap. Like it's just this is a piece of paper. It's not Jane. And I went to, my editor had asked me if I wanted to profile someone. I had never written a profile for the New Yorker at that point. And I said, well, I don't really talk to living people. I'm a historian. I don't really like people. So he said, yeah, but maybe you should try to profile. This is why my editor said, what if you try to write a profile? And I said, what about someone who's almost dead? And so I went that same weekend to Detroit to profile Robert Ettinger, who invented cryogenics. He freezes the dead. He's been doing it for years, and he's frozen his mother and both of his wives, and he was near death, and he was ready to freeze himself. And it's a hilarious story, and I found him incredibly funny, but at the same time, I went to this freezatorium, which is what it's called, although technically under Michigan law, it's a cemetery, where there are 180 people, and we walked around all the freezers, and I said, which one is like where your wife is, your first wife? And he said, there, or it could be there. And then we went in some room, and I said, well, do you have anything here for when the people wake up? Because they're supposed to wake up. And he had a photo album of his first wife. And as he was looking at it, he could barely be in the same room with it. And he had to leave. And I found it was like kids in swimming pools and in tricycles and with their red flyer wagons. And I sat in that room and I just cried and cried and cried because I was like the same person as this person. He couldn't let go either. He just like froze the dead people. I couldn't even open Jane's computer. Like, I thought it would be an amusing story about this kook, and it was like an autobiography. So the reason that I ended up profiling him was because it was the previous Halloween. Do you remember how Ted Williams had his head frozen?
Sure, that's what I've been thinking about.
Yeah. So my son, this was so Jane died in 1999. So this was like the Red Sox were exciting again after 2007. So my son wanted to be dead Ted Williams for Halloween. So we had made this giant paper mache head of Ted Williams, and then he wore his Red Sox shirt like up like this, and he carried the head around as his candy bucket. And then we had this paper mache painted Ted Williams decapitated head in the kitchen. And it came to be April when my son was turning 12 and we were having a 10, it was the 10th anniversary. We're having a birthday party, and I said, can we get rid of that effing head? And he was like, no, we keep it forever. That's the whole point. So this is why I ended up profiling the guy who freezes the dead, because my editor's like, who are you going to profile? And I'm like, I don't know anybody. Like, I was supposed to, go profile like Steven Spielberg or some celebrity. I was like, I don't know, the guy that froze Ted Williams' head? Anyway, so 10 more years passes, and now it's been 20 years, and my son's, off away, my oldest son's away in college, and I thought, I still have this stupid computer, like hanging like an albatross, the laptop that she left me in 1999, and I thought, if I'm ever gonna open it and have it work, like this is probably my last chance, especially because I apparently only do things every 10 years. So I opened it, and it nearly killed me. So I wrote the essay for my editor, and then he said, I wrote the essay about opening the computer, and then my editor said he would like to publish it.
And it was so emotional. You see some of her thoughts, you see her despair in many cases. I urge you all to read it. It's phenomenal. But you write at the end, after saying what I had said earlier, that Jane was the how and the why and the rush and the fire, the thing that had propelled you. But then you wrote, I wrote a very long book. A debt paid. I'm tired of writing books. They've always been for Jane.
Yeah, I kind of wanted to be done. Like, I wanted to be done with being so driven for that. Like, at what point was I going to ever be paid what I owed her? Also found writing this book really hard. And I also got to the end of this book and I'm like, I'll never have anything to say about American history again. I've already covered it. But I also, and so I talk about, I put the computer back in my closet. Like, I didn't throw it away. I don't know what you're gonna do with it. But I think one of the reasons there's a couple of reasons people really responded to the essay. One was I'm not known as a person who writes personal essays. And so to kind of out myself as a mother and a friend and a daughter and an emotional wreck was a lifting of the veil in some way. And but we all have people that we love that we have lost, and including children who've just gone off to college is like the happy next thing. It's still incredibly, no one talks about how sad that is. I find that incredibly sad. But I think a kind of unspoken thing is that the grief doesn't really go away. Like, I don't have Jane in my life. Like, I never filled that hole. My kids were filling a different, I would have had a completely different adulthood if she had lived. And I'm terrible at making new friends, and I can't get close to people. And I think I said, like, in the piece, like, Jane knew everybody, but I only knew Jane. And when Jane died, I didn't know anybody anymore. Like, I find it very hard to know people. And yet I was just lucky to have had her a friend for the 10 years I had her. And I think that people responded to the honesty of, yeah, when somebody you love dies, it sucks, and it never stops sucking.
But do we take that to mean no more books? Which?
No. I just finished a book today. Yeah. And B, I'm working on a podcast. And you remember, like, when people used to say, I have to go write my blog? It now feels that way to say you're working on a podcast. But I'm working on a podcast on who killed truth. Like, what is the 20th century story of what happened to truth? And that's been super fun. And the book has been rough. I'm not lie about it. I definitely, some edge of my drive has blunted since writing that essay. I'm like, that's just a real thing.
Yeah. Wow. Well, in part because you said aloud what people aren't supposed to say when they're juggernauts like you. I am tired of writing books. But I think I speak for everyone here. That's allowed. Look at that thing. But we're glad you got up again.
Thank you.
Jill Lepore.
Thank you.
So it's a little bit later than we promised, but I think we still would like to give you the opportunity for some questions. So I see a microphone there, an eager questioner. Do we have another? So is that the only microphone, Alex? I think it is. Oh, and there's a handheld back there. So let's start with the question here and then kind of try to get, is it Serena with the? Yeah, try to get Serena's attention. She'll have one too. Go ahead.
It's a long book and very good. I've read parts of it. But being so long, I suspect many people will not read it. Do you expect to, I hate to say synopsize it, but to come up with a version that has the most important parts for people who won't take the time? It's a serious question, even though it sounds funny.
No, it is a serious question. I published a little book You can buy it, I think, out there, that we in my house call These Little Truths. Because I wrote an essay after the book came out about the sort of sweep of American history and what we need to know about it for a magazine. And my editor said, let's publish that as a really short book for all the people that are never going to read the 1,000 pages. And it's called This America, the Case for the Nation. And in my view, it does that. It's a super short version of that. There's not an intermediate, like, I don't know, 400-page book or something. It's like 60 pages. It's tiny. It's like a pamphlet. That is, I did a textbook edition, but that is, if anything, longer. But I'm not going to do the intermediate thing, which I can answer later, but since there are other questions,
Well, no, I would say too that I read it all because I had an interview and we read, it's public radio, we read every word. But what I love about this book is that you can leave it someplace. Oh, the bathroom comes to mind, but you can pick it up at any point, right? And everything's fascinating. And there's always these wonderful anecdotes. I mean, who knew there were more blacks than whites in George Washington's deathbed? I mean, just these little. It's so humanized, and you can leave it and go back to it, don't you think? But anyway, another question.
That we do have copies of the little pamphlet book, but they're going quickly, so.
Okay. All right, and did somebody raise their hand? Oh, okay, well, maybe we'll get Serena over to you.
I have one right here.
Oh, he has one, and then why don't you go to the thing? Yeah, there you go.
The microphone.
Let's have the next question be a woman after
Yes,
that.
agreed.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Jill, for the book. In particular, in my case, I really appreciate the way that you took our founding fathers off their pedestal somewhat, even though they still tower above our current administration. But in particular, after writing the book, I wonder if you have given any thought to a Constitution 2.0.
That's a great question. Thank you. By the way, you should come to the mic. I meant after you. Don't. Yeah. I have thought about developing a gen ed course. I teach at Harvard, and I also teach at the law school, like a cross course between the law school and the college called the Amendments Project, where we would do constitutional history, and then the students and groups would have to draft amendments. But we would also compile a full database of all the proposed amendments and study what are the circumstances in which they were proposed. Not that the things that have been proposed ought to be undertaken, but our de facto constitutional arrangements are quite different than the design. And we have this weird brittleness about admitting that, right? Hence our jurisprudence is all a tangle of partisan positions. I don't know. I just think that that's can imagine one day writing a book. I love the idea of a book called The Amendments, but it's something I would have to teach my way to. I'd have to teach that for a long time because I'd need to learn from people, like young people in particular. So that's how I would. But I'm thinking the same thought.
Yeah.
So do we have a... Yay. Yes, would you mind? Yes. You don't have to wait.
I have one.
Up, okay.
Oh, I like to stand.
All right.
Take the stage.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this is a question about women's suffrage, because this is the 100th anniversary of women's getting the vote in this country. And I know, we're taking the founding fathers off the pedestal, but what about the women's suffrage movement and where we are now in terms of so many problems of people getting to vote and getting the information they need before they vote?
Yeah, no, thanks for that question. I'm fascinated by the implication of it, which is that suffragists are on a pedestal that they need to be knocked down from. Because I guess I would suggest that other than Susan B. Anthony or, I don't know, maybe Lucy Stone or Elizabeth Cady Stanton, we don't as a group know who we're even talking about, or we really don't know what they did and when and how. I used to do an exercise. Well, I mean, I agree with the critique. Like, we need to think very critically about the suffrage movement and its racist agenda. But it's a very different case than the founding fathers, and needs really to be distinguished from it. I used to do an exercise where I'd ask you to, and we can do this right now. Close your eyes and try to picture like a little, like as if you were like doing like an iPhoto gallery or an album on your iPhone of images of the civil rights movement. And I'm thinking you can picture the March on Washington, you can picture the Greensboro lunch counter, you can picture the Freedom Summer, you can picture Fannie Lou Hamer at the 1964 Democratic National Convention, you can, we could go on, you can picture Martin Luther King giving his Beyond Vietnam speech, you can picture Malcolm X, you can picture Ella Baker. That we'd probably have a lot of photographs that we carry, and it's the age of television, but it is largely photographs that we're picturing. And now close your eyes again and picture the suffrage movement. Okay, so photography is invented in 1839. Women first demand the right to vote in the United States in 1848. How many people can picture more than one image?
I just see white dresses and buns.
White dresses and buns, which isn't really the usual thing. I just want to say, I don't think we actually have any historical literacy about the suffrage movement. So to move from not knowing anything to saying, I don't need to know anything because they're just a bunch of racist white women is a move of profound ignorance. This is not technical, but that is a move of profound performed ignorance. If you want to engage in sustained critique with the suffrage movement, God bless. Please do. Women's history is with you. There's an incredible body of scholarship behind that. But meet the obligation to understand the movement to begin with, and to start out understanding it as a very broad and complicated movement that involves quite a tangled political history. Don't just take cartoon characters to start.
One of the starting places, it's funny, we were just talking about this, is Susan Ware from Radcliffe and a lot of her great writing. And Shana Taub was here at City Space. She's this phenomenal young musician, and she's writing a musical with the help of Susan Ware and some other women from Radcliffe about the movement, so that's going to be cool. I think we have time for 2 more. Do we have 2 more? 3 more?
It's on? Okay.
Okay, 3 more. How's that?
Thanks. Somewhere in the book, you comment that either Jefferson or Washington could have freed their slaves or thought of freeing their slaves and then didn't. It was heartbreaking observation. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. The person who acts with the most integrity on this issue among the framers is Benjamin Franklin, who had owned human beings early in his life, but comes out publicly in opposition to slavery near the end of his life. There's plenty of other really interesting people who take principled positions in the 18th century, especially evangelicals and Quakers. Those people are not represented among the founders, who were generally not religious, so they weren't stirred by the Christian claims of the equality of all human beings. Nor particularly was George Washington, but he was quite stirred by the Marquis of Lafayette, who was vehemently opposed to African slavery and the slave trade. And Washington, it's Washington, not Thomas Jefferson I was talking about. Washington, everything that Washington did established a precedent. He, resigned from being commander-in-chief at the end of the war. He, did not have a third term. Everything he did, he gave an inaugural address so everybody else did. He gave a farewell address so everybody else did. Everything he did was new, and everything he did established a precedent. And after he left office, there's considerable evidence that he was really interested in manumitting his human chattel, and didn't quite. Did do something in his will. So yeah, it is one of those. If you were interested in counterfactuals, it'd be quite an interesting counterfactual history. What would have in fact happened? Because at that time, in 1799, is when Washington died. The slavery itself was dying out in the United States. That's one of the arguments for why the northern delegates who were really opposed to slavery made so many compromises at the Constitutional Convention in 1787. They're this it's not economically viable anymore. But then 1793 is the Cotton Gin, and then there's the Louisiana Purchase, and suddenly there's the Cotton Kingdom, and slavery as an institution grows hugely, and more white Americans become interested in defending it for the sake of their own gain. And there was a moment, I think, in the 1790s when things could have gone differently.
We have one question over. Where did I see a hand? There was one here, and then we have a woman. Okay.
I came to the mic.
All right, you came to the mic, and if you want, you can go to the mic too. Yeah, and then we'll know what because I think are probably going to spend a few minutes with Jill with the books. Are you going out to the books, Jill?
What? Yeah.
Do you? Yeah. See, so we want to make sure we have that too. All right, so you're there. Go for it.
Thank you. Hi. I was wondering about your essay on Jane. Interesting how it was categorized as a narrative of somebody else, but I was so moved by it about how it really read like an autobiographical piece. And actually, I wrote you an email. I hope you didn't think that was weird. I looked up your email address, and thank you for replying. But anyway, and I wrote, I was so moved that I had a baby 10 months ago, and this is only the second night that I haven't put him to bed. Anyway, so I was so moved. It was a piece, you could say to somebody, what was this piece about? It was obviously about friendship. It was about motherhood. It was about career. It was about being a daughter. And I was curious, when you were writing that, did you intend to encompass all these beautiful themes together when you first thought, okay, I'm writing about Jane, or how did it come together, and was that intentional?
Yeah. Well, thanks for coming out. It's good to stay in. I'm a big fan of staying in, so I'm very flattered that you came out. And congratulations on the baby. And thank you for the email. This is going to annoy people who struggle with writing, but I one day opened up the computer and did this whole misery with reading through the computer, and then I sat down and I wrote the essay. That was it was not like a process of what is the essay going to be. It was an emotional, just spilling out, and it found its own structure. It is a little bit of a Rorschach test because I've got a lot of email about it, and a lot of it is from from women who've had babies and love their babies and are embarrassed to say that. Or from women who've people who are jerks at work have been jerky to them, and there's little instances of that. Yeah, go get them. Thanks for calling that out. Or people who lost a friend, or it's kind of what's your kind of live part of you that's that raw nerve that's just flailing there, is what people kind of see in it. I don't know. Maybe for me it was I'm only going to do this public confession once. It's going to be everything. So, because it kind of is the whole me. People Rob was asking what I do interviews about. I was well, I feel like I just ripped my guts out, put them on a page, and nailed them into the page. I can't talk about that now. I'm sitting here just bleeding out of my belly. I got nothing.
This is true. I mean, I had called immediately because I was so moved by it. I said, do you want to? Can we? This was how many months ago? I said, could we talk about that? And you're no, no.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And one over here, and then one over here.
Hi, Dr. Lepore. My name's Geneva. I am a resident at Brigham and Women's Hospital, and I spend a lot of time at the bedside with patients. And because I sort of went the medicine route, more new to American history, I'm embarrassed to admit, but I read your book, and I just absolutely loved it, and I read The Case for the Nation after that. So I had two things for you. First, I just wanted to share with you that while I was reading these truths, it took me a little while to get through. I had 3 patients who were also reading the book, and we had time together. We spent at the bedside enjoying your writing and talking about it. So thank you for providing me with that experience, and I can only imagine Jane would have been so happy to know that you were providing this entertainment for some of the patients in the hospital. And then my other question is, as sort of someone who's more new to American history, if you have other things, as I'm waiting for your next book to come out, to read.
Oh, well, thanks. That's so cool about your patients. That's if I was sick, the last thing I would do would be read a hard book. I'd be Netflix is my only friend. So I'm very impressed that even in their misery, your patients are ambitious intellectually. The book that I wrote that I actually love the most is this book about Benjamin Franklin's sister Jane. And there actually is a lot of medical history in it, weirdly, because she suffered so much. There were 17 children in their family. He was the youngest boy and she was the youngest girl. They're born in Boston. And there's some terrible hereditary malady in the family of the man she marries, and their children all have this devastating mental and physical problems. And you can see when Benjamin Franklin goes on to help found the Pennsylvania Hospital, which is the first public hospital, how much of that comes from his experience of witnessing his sister's suffering and her family's suffering. And she has 12 children, and they all of them die. So it's an uplifting story.
One last thought.
Yeah. I first want to thank you for your essay on E.B. White, which just...
Oh, thank you.
I cut it out and posted it by my desk. It gives hope to writers everywhere. I just love it. Your phrase, performed ignorance, really resonates with me. My daughter's at college, and she's seeing a lot of that. On the other hand, there's also the conspiracy theorizing that so many people just are suckers for, and I'm just wondering what thoughts you have about why this is happening and what educators, what we can do to sort of raise another generation up to be more critically aware, more skeptical, more able to differentiate between fact and nonsense, because we're not going to have a nation if we can't.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Thank you for that. It's a big part of why I wrote the book. It's the main reason I'm working on this podcast, which is about knowledge and how we know things. And I decided to do the podcast because I observed something in my students and even in my children going to public schools or whatever.
Cambridge, Ringe, and Latin.
Cambridge, Ringe, and Latin.
Just
Go
wanna say.
CRLS. Great school. There's nothing about it, but a lot of my Harvard College freshmen, what they seem to have learned in history classes, but actually this crosses disciplines. They have learned very well one evidentiary method, and I call it spot the bias. And their only way of evaluating a claim is to spot its bias. And so you present them with something, some argument, some happenstance, some problem. It can be chemistry. They will tell you the way in which it's biased, the claim. But if you ask them, what can you know from this claim? What do you know now that you didn't know before I acquainted you with this claim? Or we read this book together, or we watched this documentary, or we conducted this experiment. And they're like, yeah, maybe people don't get this, but maybe the educators in the room know what I'm talking about. But there's an incredible facility with, everything is a lie. So the way I demonstrate my capacity for thinking clearly is telling you in the way in which this is a lie. Well, the statistical reasoning here is fine. They're conflating causation with correlation. This is ideologically driven. This is an insufficient sample size. They have a lot of ways that is the best educated among them, who are going to be my students. They have many sophisticated ways to dismantle a claim. They have almost no habit of mind, which is actually about claiming knowledge and diffusing it to the world. And in partly, I really respect that, because when they turn on the TV and look at cable news, not when they listen to WBUR, but if they turn on the TV and listen to cable news, what they see is people claiming to know things who clearly know shit. They're all just making crap up and making specious arguments, and it's just a mess. And so they think to make a claim is to do that. So it's important to model in the world, I actually know something, and I'm an authority on this, and here's what I'm going to tell you about it. And which is really not my personal inclination. I just want to be, I don't know, what do you think? But in public, I'm always well, I know something, and here's my claim. Because nobody does that, and does it with at least an attempt at integrity. So thank you, and that's my message.
Thank you. What a wonderful, wonderful evening. Jill Lepore, Harvard Bookstore, WBUR. The books are out there.
And Robin Young!
Oh, and me. Thank you for coming.